Now, when you buy one of the floral flap trim pieces, you're going to receive the following things. Your flap trim piece. I'll show you what that looks like. There's the front, there's the back. So you'll see there's 3 holes on the back piece. That's where you're going to add your screws. And then you're going to receive this small bag, and that's your screws. So I usually try to include an extra because maybe one of them doesn't work properly or you might lose one. So there should be 4 little screws. And then you're going to receive this magnetic snap, and it matches the finish on your trim piece that you purchased. And it's just the 2 washers and then the male and the female half of a magnetic snap. So you do need, this is just a decorative piece, so this is what's going to be your flap closure. Now, when you purchase a flap trim, you're also going to receive a link to download this PDF file for your, it's a flap trim piece, but it's a pattern piece to customize the flap pattern piece of whatever pattern you're going to be using. Now, the black solid line at the bottom, that indicates where your actual metal trim piece will be located on your flap. And then the gray box shows you uh, a, a minimum width for the flaps. So it's not going to work for tiny flaps. They have to be a little bit wider than the middle trim piece. So if you look, there's where my black line is. And then you need to continue the flap in this direction following the shaded box. So I'm going to use my Sweet Pea Saddlebag flap piece as an example here for customization. It is a cut on the fold piece, but to make this modification, I actually almost always print out 2 copies of a flat piece, even if it's cut on the fold. I just find it easier for fussy cutting. So I have 2 pieces, and I tape them together. So I'll show you, this is the back side, this is the front side. I've already done the flap trim piece for you, but I want to show you before I tape this this pattern piece on top. So this is what it looks like, and I have 2 pieces taped together at the fold line. Do not cut along the bottom edge. So I left this part uncut because this is where we're going to need to customize the shape of our flap. So if you flip it over, you'll notice that this pattern piece has a center mark here, and then I left a faint center line all the way up. And this is just so that you can make sure that when you place this template over your flat pattern piece that you have it perfectly centered. Then, once you have it taped, you want to tape the bottom edge here at the bottom edge of your flap. And then you'll see that my sweet pea flap goes this way, but we need it to curve up a little bit. So that's a part that you're going to need to trim. But then I also needed to customize this part because I need this edge to continue in this direction. If I let it curve up like this, there would be a gap between the edge of my flap and the trim piece. So I don't want a gap. I want it to fit snugly against the entire edge. So I just drew a new shape here that maintained that straight edge here of the shaded portion of this template. Now, I don't want to hand draw this on both sides. So the best way to do this is to just cut out this first side. And stop when you get to the center. Okay, and then you'll want to take this part off. Cut that away. Okay, and then you'll want to fold the entire flap at that center mark. So the center fold line, that's where you're going to want to fold it in half. And then you're going to draw out that shape on the other half. Okay, and make sure that You then cut out the other half, matching the first half, because you really want your flap to be symmetrical on both sides. And now you're ready to cut out your flap pieces. So I've now completed the sweet pea flap, and I'm checking to make sure that my flap trim piece fits properly, and it looks pretty good. So what you're going to need for the installation is obviously your flap, and it should have the magnetic snap installed, your flap trim piece, and you're going to need something to punch some holes. So I just have this rotary hole punch and a ruler, some glue. I'm using E6000, but when you're inserting the screws, if you have Loctite, you could always use Loctite. That would be great. And then a small screwdriver. And you're going to need the screws that came with your flap. Sorry, your flap trim. Okay, so the first thing to do is to make sure that we're installing the trim piece centered. So you know that the center of the magnetic snap, if you follow that straight down, that's the center of your flap here. But I also want to have a center mark at the top of the flap here. So I'm just making a very faint mark with a pencil. And you want that to be on the underside of your flap. And then when you're placing the trim piece, so you should be, if you're looking at the underside of your flap, you want to be looking at the wrong side of the flap trim piece. And what we want is to make sure that everything is centered. So I'm going to use a ruler, and a clear ruler I find the best, and you want to have everything centered. So you want this to be at the center mark, this through the center of the snap, and then you want the middle hole. So there's 3 holes on the back of your flap trim. You want the center hole to be aligned with all those other center marks, and that's how you're going to know that your trim piece is centered. That a little bit over. Okay, so that looks about right. Now, before you start making your marks, you want to also make sure that you have the flap inserted inside the opening of the flap trim piece all the way. And then you want to mark the location of those 3 holes. Now this part is always makes me a little nervous, because we have a completed flap and then we're basically punching holes in it. But unfortunately we need to do that to install the trim piece. So I'm just making sure that my holes are lining up properly. Now, one thing you'll want to make sure of is to not put too much material in the layers of your flap, because you do have a certain thickness allowed here, so you don't want to make a flap that is so thick that the flap trim piece won't fit anymore. Okay, so I have my 3 holes now, and so now I'm going to use the smallest punch on my hole punch. It's 0, that's the smallest, and I want to punch out those holes. Now, if you're using fabric for your flap, you're going to want to add some fray check. But because I'm using vinyl, I don't really have to use fray check. My vinyl doesn't fray, so it's really not an issue for me. So I'm punching out those 3 holes. And you don't even really, I find you don't have to worry too much about punching all the way through the layers. As long as you have a good hole that the little screw will catch. Okay, and then put that flap trim piece back. Now, I'm going to put a piece of tape here because I don't want to scratch my trim piece when I'm doing this. Okay, and then just make sure that you're lining up in those holes again. Unfortunately, my smallest hole punch isn't very sharp anymore, so this is really not ideal. So now, if you want this to be really extra secure, I would actually put just a thin strip of glue inside the frame here. Now, if you get some glue on the nice parts, like the outside parts of your trim piece, my cap is glued on here. You can remove it. I use a cotton swab and I dip it in acetone and I very carefully remove any glue that I get. That usually works. Just make sure that you don't get any acetone on either your vinyl or your fabric. Okay, so I had a little bit of trouble getting my glue to come out, but I finally have it. So I'm just adding a thin strip of glue here at the bottom. Okay, you probably can't see this on camera, but there's glue. And insert this like this. Okay. And then, if you have Loctite, now's the time to use Loctite. I don't have any, so I will just add these screws. Now, you could also just use E6000. And it's pretty simple. Once you've added that glue, you just insert your 3 screws. And there's one. I actually have Loctite upstairs, but I forgot to bring it down, so I'm going to take the screws out and add that later. But I think it is better if you do add a drop of Loctite in each screw hole before you add those screws. Now, I don't add the flap trim once my entire bag is finished because if I do happen to have a bit of bad luck and make a mistake attaching my flap trim piece, I didn't make a mistake on a fully assembled bag. I've only have to remake my flap. That's why I always add something like this at this stage. But do whatever you're more comfortable with. Okay. Whoop. And did get a little bit of glue there, but I think it comes off fairly easily off vinyl. Yeah, it's just rubbing off. Okay. And I have my tape piece, but here we go. There's our assembled flap with our flap trim piece.